welcome to Moving Minds. My name is Aarti, and today we're going to talk about how, as a parent and a teacher, you can support children who are attending online classes. Over the last, over the whole year, in fact, we've been seeing a lot of changes in our lives because of the pandemic, and especially for children, because it started with them not having been able to complete their previous academic year to now having to start their entire school year online. This has changed the way they deal with their teachers, their academics. It's also changed how teachers interact with the students. They went from starting having a class full of students in front of them to having a screen full of them. Parents have also found the pressure because they have to monitor what their kids are doing and manage work at home. So, to address all of these needs and to understand how we can help these children as parents and teachers, we have with us today Radhika S D'Costa, the school counselor of Malia Aditi International School in Bangalore. I'm just going to introduce her and pass it on to her before we begin the seminar. Radhika has been working at Malia Aditi International School for a decade. Her work primarily involves meeting with parents, teachers, and students, both in groups and individually. Her work is towards enhancing the mental health of people in the school system. She has experience diagnosing and remedying specific learning disabilities and has a great interest in understanding parent-child relationships, mental health and technology, and also helping out children who have diagnosed with depression. Just before I hand it over to Radhika, I'd just like to remind all our viewers that we are regularly posting links on the comment section. These are resources from the White Swan Foundation portal for teachers and parents on how you can support your children. So remember that if there is a topic we're talking about and you'd like to learn more, you can always visit that link. We also have a Q&A happening throughout the webinar, aside from the conversations that we'll be having. So please feel free to post your questions in the comment section and we will address them with Radhika. Over to you, Radhika.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks so much, Aarti. And I'm so glad that we're doing this because I think that this is such a pertinent issue right now. Life for all of us changed overnight, and our ways of working saw dramatic changes that we were not necessarily ready for. And I think I feel particularly strongly for children because so much of their lives are things that they're dependent on us for. So they take a lot of the cues out of what we are able to support them with. So I feel like in order to support children, we need to really get a handle on what's going on with our kids nowadays. What is something that possibly they're struggling with? What are some things that are very age appropriate for them to be displaying as a reaction to the pandemic that they're right in the middle of? And I think as parents, and I speak even as a parent, I think parenting has become a 24/7 job. There is absolutely no break from it. It is exhausting. There are several roles that a parent is playing. So I think that we really need to be supporting parents. And if parents are feeling supported, I'm certain that they've been in a position to support children much, much better than if they were not supported. And I think this is true for teachers as well. Teachers have made dramatic changes to how they work. I mean, they've gone from small holding spaces with their classes to having these, for lack of a better word, but non-intimate spaces with their class, with their students, and having to completely change their ways of teaching. So I think that what everybody has done fantastically is just sort of moved into action and just been able to deliver overnight. Yeah, but I think what we need to recognize is that there's a lot going on with all of us. Yeah, so I'd like to actually just talk a little bit about why this topic is so important for us to address and why this is something that we need to really be talking about in our houses, in our, in our schools, and just seeing what we can do to support children and ourselves. So I'm just going to start with running a presentation, a slide right now. Aarti, just let me know if it is visible.
Yes, it's visible.
Yeah? Okay, right. So I just want to talk a little bit about why we need to be doing this and why is it that child and adolescent mental health matters at this point. And I think it always does, but I feel like at this point we're experiencing, and kids are experiencing a lot more stress than they have necessarily experienced earlier. So right from, I think it was March 10th or 9th when schools just shut, and we went through a period of constant change. And things opened up, things closed down again, then schools were shut, schools opened again. So kids have had to roll with a lot of things that they didn't really know how to respond to, and the stress has been prolonged. So we're talking about stress in terms of not being able to see peers, or stress in terms of finding academics a whole lot harder to navigate and make sense of, or being in a situation where possibly there's more conflict at home. Stress has been higher for children, and not knowing the end date to when the stress is going to end, I think makes it another very important reason for us to begin to address this, and not to just wait and see how kids deal with stuff and then to pick it up when we get back to our lives as they used to be. I also think that while stress has increased, the access to coping mechanisms or coping tools that children use has really come down. So there was a point when they were possibly completely absent. So, no one was even allowed to step out of the house. I couldn't even meet a friend, keeping in mind certain safety regulations. Now that's gotten a little bit, a little bit more relaxed. But I think that with higher stress and lower access to coping tools available, what we're really seeing is kids experiencing a lot more distress than they may have done earlier. And I think that stress management, or how I learn to cope with stress, is not something that I do in isolation. I do it as a part of my experiences. So if I'm possibly a 10th grader and I'm going through some stuff, it's my friend who tells me what I can do at that moment. And that becomes a lesson in stress management for me. Or if I'm a younger child and I'm finding something very hard in school, I have a teacher who's concerned about me and who teaches me to possibly just take a couple of minutes and come back into the classroom when I'm feeling a little bit calmer. And these are some opportunities that I think students have really lost out on, because we're also looking at sometimes children not being able to interact with too many adults because adults are working at home or adults are busy with household stuff. And it's really a lot more stress, and not really knowing what to do with this stress that I'm suddenly feeling so much of. And I think that another thing that's really important to notice and to really keep in mind is that as adults, we're experiencing a whole lot of mental health related concerns as well. So not having access to, recreational activities, not being able to go out, having difficulties with my own sleep, all of these things would be impacting me as an adult. So if I'm a parent or a guardian or a grandparent, how I'm doing will have a relationship with, or will connect to how my child is doing as well. So we're looking at why we need to support our children. It's because how we are feeling is impacting them as well. So we really need to be noticing what's going on and addressing stuff that's coming up. And I think why we need to really talk about it is because a lot of research has come about in talking about what are some of these effects of the pandemic. So I just want to just very quickly go through some of these. And before I get into what these concerning effects, I'd like to say that reactions have been varied to the pandemic. I don't think it's fair to say that every child is experiencing a lot more stress than they did earlier. I know for a lot of children and possibly teenagers who maybe had issues with bullying or difficulties in school or body image issues or a bunch of different things that made school stressful, this has been a very helpful situation for them. So it's not to say that the pandemic has only been stressful, but I think it's worth acknowledging that these are some of the commonly reported concerns that we're seeing in different age groups, right? So we're seeing kids worrying a lot more because there's just so much more access to worrying information, worrying about their health of a family member, and then the worrying can get extended to other aspects as well. Difficulty concentrating, and I'm seeing that this is something that kids as little as like toddlers right up to university students are reporting difficulties in staying focused on their lessons or focused with activities they were doing. There's a lot more boredom because there's just so much more time hanging on these kids, and there's not very much that they can do with their time. So there's, if you have a younger child, you're going to see boredom manifesting in complaining or whining or demanding a lot more time out of you as a parent. In older children, you're possibly seeing it more as irritability or withdrawal and just being by themselves. And I think there's a lot more restlessness as well in children at this point. Children are also being noticed to be more irritable than they were earlier, more easy to tear and cry. They're feeling a lot more lonely. So I think this lack of having any contact with peers has really gotten them to feel very isolated. And I think everybody's experience of the pandemic has been very different. So even their own experiences of the pandemic. So if I am, not comfortable and I'm very anxious about stepping out, that experience has been even more isolating for me, because I do see other people being comfortable with it, but I'm not. So I think there is increase in feelings of isolation, low mood, reduced motivation, very common for kids to not enjoy the academics at this point, feel like there's really nothing to look forward to, and it's really a task to get myself to do the assignments that I could seem to just go through very easily earlier. And a concerning thing that a lot of students are reporting is tendencies towards wanting to harm themselves, run away from home, ideation about, suicidal or having suicidal thoughts. I think that this is something that's really crucial and needs to be addressed. So maybe if this comes up later on in the conversation, we can look at this. And of course, kids are experiencing a lot of sleep difficulties, finding it harder to fall asleep as they did earlier, waking up often during the day, and that's leading to fatigue and tiredness the next day. And of course, even just doing everything online is a whole lot more tiring. There is such a thing as Zoom fatigue. So we are then looking at kids being a lot more tired, which will very directly impact their motivation levels, their irritability. So we're seeing quite a lot happening with our kids. And changes in appetite. Some kids just not reporting feeling as hungry as they did earlier, or just some who are feeling a lot more hungry than they did earlier. Yeah. So why is this happening? And I want to just run very quickly through some of what has gone away from our lives, and some factors that have just increased so much more in our lives, which is possibly contributing to these changes in child and adolescent mental health. So predictability, which is what I think all human beings, but particularly children and adults and adolescents thrive on, has just gone. Routines don't exist anymore. There is no need to get up at a particular time and get ready for school as it was earlier. So I think routines have gone away. So that sense of predictability and control over my day has gone away. Physical activity has tremendously reduced. There isn't as much stimulation from in-person learning, that they're getting on their online learning. Play for younger children, interaction with peer group, which is just so validating for them as an experience, don't exist, or exist really, really sporadically. And I'm hearing a lot of students say, it's just not the same online, so I'd rather not do it at all. So I think that that's something that we need to look at. Participation in recreational activities, there's only so much that you can possibly do online. So kids who are greatly into sport are just finding that they don't enjoy the sport as much online as they did. And access to supportive adults. And I think that this is something that school provided that space for. School wasn't necessarily just about learning curriculum. It was also knowing that I could talk to a teacher when I was going through something, and she would understand me and help me with it, or he would be able to get where I was coming from. So I think these are some of the things over the last few months that have just gone away. What's possibly increased right now, or is present and wasn't present anymore, is uncertainty, not knowing when things will go back to being normal. Will it ever be normal again? I'm enjoying, say that a kid is feeling like I'm enjoying this period so much, is it going to be hard for me to get back? And of course, there's a lot more stress right now, academic, home related, personal, just an increase in the amount of stress. There's also so much of an increase in guardian and parental stress levels. So I think that, like we talked about earlier, has an impact on the child as well. Conflict in the house is possibly higher because parents are spending a lot more time at home. Stresses are larger in numbers. So there's, and I think children possibly were earlier out of the house a lot more. Now they aren't, so they're getting privy to a lot of information that perhaps they didn't have earlier. There are more things to think about. So if I'm in 12th grade, I'm thinking about, am I actually going to go to college next year? What is this going to look like for me? And there's technology related fatigue that has just increased so much. So I just wanted to just share this as what could be contributing. And I'll stop here, and maybe we can start with the questions that you'd like to go with.
Sure. Thank you, Radhika. I think that was a really good start to the webinar. We have a good understanding of why we have to do something like this.
Right.
You did mention about a lot about how kids may not be feeling the connect with academics that they had previously, right? So there are a lot of parents who do come up with concerns about how this affects them in the long term, because this is an entire year of them not having access to a physical school space. And learning online, it's all patchy. They're not in that zone as much. So there, a lot of parents often ask about how this affects the child's academics in general. So what do we often do in these kind of
Yeah, I
situations?
think that's a very fair question. There's a doubt of, is my child going to be at a detrimental position with this year that's come about being? I think that yes, learning would have certainly been reduced when we're learning at home versus what they would have been able to achieve in class. That is a reality, but I don't know if it helps to think about that very much because it doesn't sound like that's really something that's within our control. Um, I think what parents can possibly look at is what are things or supports I can create in the house to ensure that my child is able to learn as much as he or she can access at this point. Because really, being concerned about what my child is missing out is not going to help in your child learning that, because it may also help to know that everybody is more or less at the same playing level field. All your child's peers are accessing only that much. They syllabi are reduced. There are different ways in which teachers are going about teaching the same thing. So I think maybe if you're shifting that focus to just saying, okay, yes, it is possibly going to change how much my child is going to be able to learn. But what is something as a parent that I can do to ensure maximum learning with the constraints that this situation has, put on us?
Okay. And similarly for teachers, because there are teachers who often feel, like you again said, that they're suddenly moving online, right? And they do feel concerned that there are students who they can feel are not learning as much as they would. Of course, I'm sure if the teachers they're in person, they can see
Absolutely.
certain signs, and now that's not there. So how would a teacher deal with this situation?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think before we get into more teacher questions, I really want to congratulate teachers for what they have
Yes,
done. I mean, it's
absolutely.
been amazing to see how they have overnight just made themselves so comfortable with software and made kids so comfortable with software as well. So I think that teachers should really take a moment to appreciate and pat themselves on the back for this dramatic change that they have made in their working styles. But I can understand that there is a limitation in how effective you feel as a teacher, because there is only, firstly, I think you're getting very limited amount of information from the child. And sometimes kids are switching off their cameras. You don't know if they're there, you don't know if they're quite getting what you're teaching them. So I would recommend that teachers sort of identify who those kids are that they're concerned about. Is it a pattern that you're seeing? Children are not giving in their homework, they're disengaged from class, they're not turning up regularly enough, or they're looking sleepy. So if you're able to identify that there are some children who are sort of causes for concern, then if they're younger children, I would suggest that they reach out to parents and sort of just try and troubleshoot what's going on. Why is, sometimes it's just something very small, like adjusting the child's sleep routine, or it is something like making sure the kid has breakfast before sitting down. Sometimes it's just really minor things that parents may not have been able to think about as well. So a conversation, I think it's really important for home and school to be quite communicative, because right now home and school are, I mean, the boundaries are very blurred. But I think with older children, I would suggest that first having that conversation with the child before involving a parent would be helpful, because I think children who are older want to take on more ownership with their own learning. So we need to give them that opportunity to do it without it seeming like we're complaining to parents. So some things that I've worked, I think, is identifying those children, maybe looking at extra classes for them, maybe looking at changing, like just sort of modifying your expectations from children at that point. It doesn't necessarily have to be what they were capable of doing earlier. And I think one thing that teachers can think about is, if a lot of kids seem to be struggling with it, perhaps you have to experiment a bit with your teaching methodology. Maybe you want to, do like quizzes, or take a break from academic time and just have kids talk about how they're feeling, and or do, a mix of videos and self-learning, and just sort of get creative with it versus just lecturing, because we are likely to lose kids more now with lecturing than we did earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm assuming that for parents as well, like you
Yeah.
mentioned, they do need to create that environment where a kid can learn better, right? So, how do parents help motivate their children? Suppose the kids are feeling demotivated in academics at this point. What are some tips that you could give parents to kind of help in that?
I think the first thing I would recommend very, very strongly is for parents to just validate what their kids are feeling. I feel sometimes as parents, the anxiety is so high in ourselves that my child's going to, be at a disadvantage, that we're just trying to constantly fix it. We're trying to give solutions and say, no, but this, don't you realize this is a really important year? And I know where that concern is coming from. But what kids possibly need at this point is just a good listening ear. They just need to understand that we empathize with their difficulties. Perhaps as a parent, I may share what's been hard for me as well in my work, or if I'm at home, how it's been harder for me to handle these changes that have come about being. So I think if you're looking at then the solutions flow from there. But if we sort of come with pre-decided sort of solutions for them, kids are not then necessarily engaging with what we're saying, and they're then becoming defensive. So I think validating, trying to come up with solutions together, check in on how things are going with them. So I think that would be very directly related to academics, but I do see a lot of value in other things like ensuring that kids are getting enough sleep, building some kind of routine where we're ensuring the whole household winds down early on, because I do know that adult sleep schedules have also gone for a toss completely. But if we're modeling that as adults and getting kids to sleep early, or if we're ensuring that there's some kind of physical activity that the child is engaging in within constraints that have been sort of laid on us, these are some things that would be helpful for children to start with.
Okay, all right. And this kind of easily goes into the whole idea of Zoom fatigue, which you had
Right.
also
Yes.
mentioned. So that's, I think, one of parents' biggest concerns, right? That
Mm.
kids are
Yeah.
using technology all day, and then their idea of a downtime is also to probably watch something on Netflix or something like that. And I've also heard a lot of people complain about, I think as adults too, doing work as well, our break from work seems to be looking into our phones. So this is difficult for children, and it's and since they don't really socialize as much as they used to, they might also talk to their friends online. So how, and a lot of parents do seem concerned about this and feel like the screen time has increased a bit too much for their children. So how do we balance it out? Because having school on screen is non-negotiable at this point. So then what
Absolutely.
happens?
Yeah, yeah. I think that perhaps we need to think a little bit more flexibly about screen time, knowing that. So I have this image that I'd like to just share, where I think that it, maybe I'll just talk about that when I share that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that for healthy development of children, we need to be looking at a mix of activities or important skills, because these are the ones that are sort of needed for children to develop health in a healthy manner. So we're looking at sleep, we're looking at schooling and reading, we're looking at social and family connections, physical activities, some amount of contribution to the household in terms of chores and things that they go beyond themselves with. And then there's technology. And here's where I think technology has just come into all of our lives uninvited. We didn't expect to be on our screens as much. But I think that if you're looking at technology as a stopgap way of fulfilling some of these other needs. So maybe at this point, I do need to use a lot more screen time to engage with, my friends, or I do need to maybe think of this a little bit differently, saying as long as my child is using this technology to, make sure that she's doing like a Zoom dance class, or he's doing like a football class, I'm still using it as a tool, and I'm leveraging technology towards something else that's really healthy for my child. But if you're noticing that technology is not meeting these needs, and it's just something that's just entirely recreational, coming in the way of sleep, and is not, and a lot of these other things are not happening in your child's life, then it's a good time to talk about setting some limits with your technology. So I think that, so if you're finding that your child isn't maybe having conversations with friends, but is just gaming excessively and gaming into the night, then I would say that that's a good point to come in as a parent and say, look, I know there's not very much else to do, but we need to look at you sleeping enough, or we need to maybe look at you using technology to speak to your friends. Or so I think that it's harder now to give that number of how many hours my child can be on the screen, because I think that each household is so different from the other in terms of so if you have both parents working and younger children, there is a likelihood that kids are going to be on their screens a lot more. I think just do what works for your family, keeping in mind that there needs to be a balance between these things. Yeah. Does that answer the question that you had?
Yes, absolutely. I
Okay.
think it helps to know that we can't tell people not to use their screens
I
anymore.
think so. And
It's not, yeah.
yeah, I just like to add there that especially with teenagers, if please allow them to stay in touch with their friends using their screens. I think a lot of parents are rightfully very concerned, because pre-COVID there was so much conversation about not being on screens and screens being bad for you. But I think that if we're just looking at saying that this is not permanent, right now my child is going to be getting a lot more out of hanging out with his or her friend, or watching a movie, they're doing workouts together, or there's a movie playing and their friends are on their screens. I think that's giving them a lot more to just sort of get on with things than depriving them of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I just would like to pause here to remind everyone who's tuned in to put in your questions in the comment section. We will be taking up all the questions that come up and discussing them with Radhika. So remember to put it in. We'll do it as and when we speak. We do actually have our first question from Varun Ranganathan. The question says, my son is struggling so much to not use Google when classes are going on and has been mature enough to admit to it. He constantly keeps Googling Pokemon and other such stuff when classes are going on. He struggles to pay attention in class and focus on what the teacher says, and invariably misses out on key information.
Yeah. And I really, I feel for you, because as a parent, what do I do? Do I step in and monitor my child during classes, because that's not something that's sustainable, or do I let it go? Or how do I handle this? I know that this is something that a lot of parents are struggling with. So I think maybe if you can look at having conversations around why it is important to be doing just schoolwork when schoolwork is required to be done, setting aside separate time for your child to maybe look up whatever he wants to. So maybe in your routine, if you're just saying, okay, I know that it's tempting, and it is tempting. I think that even as an adult, it's very hard for me to not pick up my phone when I get a message and I'm working. So I know that that's a temptation that kids are not built to yet handle. They were not ready for this kind of technology in their life. So I think we have to look at building those skills. So if you're then saying that, okay, 5 o'clock to 5:30, you can look these things up, but this is the time for you to be focusing on what needs to be done in class. So if there are breaks that are given, then allow your child to use that break in a screen free manner, so that your child then feels motivated to come back to class, or is not as tired to attend that next class. Also, just check in on how your child is finding academics. Does he need a little bit more support with understanding what's going on? So stay in touch maybe with the teachers to understand, as a parent, is there something that you need to maybe do or that can help your child in, because sometimes I think kids just switch off from it when it's hard, or if they feel like they're not interested in. So is there a way to try and get him a bit more engaged with his academics and set aside time for stuff that he's interested in, and see if that helps in him just staying. And if you find that I think you really need to appreciate your child for admitting to it. I think that it's really hard for kids to admit to this, knowing that they are going to be upsetting a parent by saying this. So I think just use that as another thing to be reinforcing with your child, and take this opportunity to also talk about honesty and how you appreciate it. And I think that's another lesson maybe you can bring in with your child at this point.
Yeah, I think that's it's important to have the conversations even as parents. We do actually have a question from a teacher which is similar to this.
Okay.
Saishta asks, "What are practical steps to help children deal with online fatigue?" Um,
Yeah.
so, how does a teacher advise students in this case?
I know it's a tough one, because there's really no taking a break from the tools that you need to be using. I think it helps to give breaks to ensure that if there are 30-40 minute lessons, to ensure that there is a 10-minute break in between, and to talk to kids about, I mean, they may not listen to us, but at least you put it out there as why it is important to take a break from screens at that time. So maybe you're just getting them to look at what else they could do, go and drink some water, get a snack, um, do some jumping jacks, move around a little bit so that the tiredness comes down. Another thing that I think has been helpful is to get kids to blink more often. I think what tends to happen is there's a lot more tiredness because when we're on screens, we're not blinking enough, and that tires the muscles out. So if you're maybe, bringing that into your conversation with your students, that may be another thing to look at. And perhaps if there is some stuff that they can do not on screens, but if they're writing stuff out and just taking pictures and sending that reduces one screen. But I don't know if we'll be able to eliminate the fatigue. Maybe it's also good to talk to children about other healthy activities. And I know I'm going on about this, but I really feel strongly about the sleep bit. So, because that is still something that stays within the sphere of influence of a child and a family. So, if you're maybe talking to children about getting exercise, eating regularly, healthy stuff, sleeping enough, and maybe just what are some things that they can begin to do offline, interests that they have that they can look at in some other way, and you're looking at online things, just sort of capturing it rather than needing to engage with it online.
Correct. Yeah. So you did mention earlier that it's important for teenagers to talk to their friends, right? There is a lot of concern among parents on how to keep have help the child keep up with their social skills,
Yeah.
because they it is one they a lot of children aren't very social, so they may find it difficult not having to be in that position of having to speak to someone else,
Yeah.
especially during classes. So how can parents help with something like
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, so I think that social skills are things that we don't learn in a vacuum. We learn it in our interactions. And now that the social world doesn't exist to a very large extent, we have to look at using virtual interaction. So if your child is younger, maybe you're looking at setting up play dates, or you're looking at, very themed interactions. So every child is possibly bringing in their favorite book or I think with younger kids, you need to give it a direction. It cannot be something that they will be able to figure out. But with older children, I think allowing them to stay online a little longer than you would like for them to would be helpful for them. I think for them to begin to continue to stay connected to peers who get it the way, to really get them. I think as adults, our set of stresses will be very different from children's stresses. So I think that virtually, those are some of the things that we could look at. I think some families are beginning to be comfortable with children meeting outdoors while using masks. But again, that would be what works for your family. Look at what works for you as a family. And I think this is something that, again, requires a conversation because, and here's where I want to talk a little bit about how, as adults, we have usually fewer milestones in our lives than children do. So I think that if your child does want to meet with a friend, have a conversation about it, look at how your child can be safe. So that's one way to look at with the peer group. I think within the family, though, we can still look at things. Maybe you're looking again with your younger children at using books to highlight social skills, using shows that they watch to, maybe take a minute pause there and help your child understand that this is what empathy looks like, or this is what this person did when their friend was upset. So you're still bringing into awareness what some of those social skills are that are required to navigate the social world. And with older children and younger children, I think maybe if you're just looking at just setting up rituals with them, you're looking at having routines that involve interaction. I think that everybody has sort of gotten so busy with their own stuff that not too many families have the time to come together and do things together. So if that can be built in, I think it also gives children and adults something to look forward to enjoy each other's company. But I think that's the best that we can do at this point, and know that that's the best that you are doing the best that you can do at this point with it.
Okay. Also, moving on to signs of distress, I think this is something we've spoken about in the past a lot as well. How parents can look out for signs of distress in their children, and teachers can look out for signs of distress in students. So to start with, let's just look at the parents thing and how do parents. I think you did talk about it a little bit in the beginning, but what are some obvious signs of distress among children that a
Mhm.
parent can look out for at a time like this to and then help them out? And this is pertaining to their academics as well. Like how do they
Sure. Yeah.
highlight that?
Yeah. So I think any very dramatic change in how your child is behaving, or lot of changes over a period of time. So if you're finding things like sleep affected, appetite impacted, aches and pains that are sort of unexplained, there's no cause for it. Those are some very good signs that there's something going on and we need to be addressing it. Unfortunately, there isn't an exhaustive list because each child is going to show different kinds of symptoms or different kinds of signs that they're struggling. But things like being more irritable, younger children being a lot more needy than they were, clingy, finding it hard to go to bed, having more frequent nightmares. For older children, a lot of withdrawal from family. So with older children, I think they tend to anyway withdraw from family. But if you're finding that your child is also withdrawing from friends, you don't find your child as much on the phone as she or he was earlier, not doing the things that they found very interesting, or making comments about then not liking the way things were going, or feeling like no one's going to miss me if I'm not around. So pick up on those comments that your child is making, and I think that's a good time to then get into having a very open conversation with your child about it.
Um, and I think again, the things that you said about comments that children make do also talk about self-harm and suicidal ideation in among children.
Yes.
So since you brought that up earlier as well, could you just explain a little bit more so that people can understand that this is a very
Yeah.
real possibility and how they can look out for it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think what children do is they don't necessarily talk about it as openly as, they won't come up to you and say, I'm feeling suicidal, or I feel like hurting myself. We have to really look for those cues because they're they're not sure how to bring it up. It's a very difficult thing to bring up, or they don't want to hurt their parents. They don't want to add to the stress that kids are experiencing. So I think if you are picking up on a bunch of things, or you are finding that your child is saying these things, check in with yourself first on how you're feeling about it, because you need to be in a position to have a very open conversation with your child about it. You need to be in a position to listen and not, you know, say things like, but what is there to be upset about? Everybody is in this position. You have everything. Those are your reactions. Those are your ways of trying to make sense of it. But that's not what the child needs. What the child needs is an understanding of the fact that I understand this is really hard for you, and let's see what we can do about it. And I would suggest, if your child is making comments like, what's the point of it, or no one's going to miss me anyway, or things like that, please reach out for help. I don't think that this is something that the child will just get over. We need to teach children and give them skills on how to handle that situation, or those feelings that come up.
Also, this something that how do teachers kind of come in at this space? Because
Yeah,
we do talk a lot about signs of physical signs of self harm at school. Obviously, again, that's not something that's possible for teachers to
yeah.
detect anymore. So, how do you recommend that teachers have conversations about this in classes, even if it's online, and how do they really navigate this
Yeah,
situation?
yeah. I think the access the teachers have to cues that the child is struggling are just not present anymore. I'm just seeing, a bit of the child. Or very often kids are, like I said earlier, turning off their cameras, so I have no way of knowing. So I think it's really important to look at the socio-emotional functioning part as well as the academic. I actually very strongly feel like the curriculum can still be caught up on, and I know this is maybe a controversial statement to make, but I feel like that can be picked up. But what we really need to do is to be able to help kids handle the situation that they're in at this point. We don't know situations at home. We don't know what's going on. By offering that space to talk about these things, or having mechanisms where we refer a child who's struggling, or we reach out to a parent if there are concerns, we're actually displaying helping behavior towards the child. So maybe if you're talking about COVID and what that's doing to children, and how can children handle these things, what are things that they can do to just cope with the feelings that they're having. I think that's really important at this point.
Okay. Yeah. We do have a question from one of
Okay.
the audience. Neela Kantan asks, how can the teachers ensure that the children participate? From the times of the teachers telling the kids in the classroom to not talk in class to now, where even getting them to
Yeah,
acknowledge their presence in class is difficult.
yeah. Yeah, I think yes, it's completely changed. Now we want kids to make noise, and we're finding that kids are just far too silent, and it's really hard. I think let's listen to what the kids have to say. What may be more helpful ways for them to address a particular topic? Are they, I know with some classes they're looking at breakout rooms and having smaller group presentations. So I think this is really a good time for us to be listening to how kids want curriculum delivered, get them more involved in it, and not necessarily look at curriculum as just being, okay, I finished my lesson plan, I've finished what I had to teach. Because we need kids to be engaged in learning. Their attitudes towards learning have a huge role to play in how they achieve and how motivated they stay. So I think it's good to get, if get that dialogue going and get kids to really say how they would like to be involved in their learning process.
And since we did speak about COVID and how isolating it was, the fear of the virus and things like that, there is a lot. What if? How do teachers often have these conversations with children? Because, for example, if one of the students in the class has been diagnosed with COVID and hasn't been attending classes, it is distressing for children, especially younger children who probably don't understand exactly what this could mean. So, how does a teacher address this in the classroom and have this conversation with the
Yeah.
class?
Okay. So I think we need to look at what is age appropriate, giving information that is not overwhelming for the child, but information that equips the child with adequate knowledge. So I think if you're talking about a situation where a classmate has COVID, first maybe looking at taking consent from that child's family to talk about it. But I think if that child's family is okay with that information being shared, maybe we're looking at also updating the class on how the child is recovering, not necessarily needing to talk about it every day, because then that sort of, it may be far too much, and then their attention just moves completely to just the fact that there is this illness that is so prevalent in everybody's lives. But I think it's also a good way to get to just educating children more, because I children take what they want out of it, right? And sometimes they don't want to accept things that are very real and out there. So it's a good time. And I think it's easier for teachers to do this, because kids always take what's coming from school much better than they take what's coming from home. So maybe you're looking at dispelling certain myths about things, but keeping your focus to what as a child can you do to keep yourself and your community safe. So I think we're just going to keep to that thing, while just maybe, or maybe when the kids are a little bit older, looking at how can a peer, a classmate help out this kid who's been unwell. Someone takes notes for him or her, just getting the class a bit more involved in supporting someone who is unwell at that point.
Correct. This actually brings me to the next one on how a teacher can have non-academic dialogues with their class. What are the ways and what are suggestions that you might
Yeah,
have for them
yeah.
to connect with the students on a level that's not just academic? Because right now, that's essentially the only reason why you'd meet your teacher.
Yeah, right. I think we need to look at the fact that curriculum has been broken, has been shortened, and syllabi have been reduced. So if there is time, it's good to use that time to connect with kids. So I think in non-academic, I think just running regular non-academic interaction spaces. So if you're looking at kids bringing in their lunches and everybody's just chatting at that time, or looking at someone bringing in I know that kids are bringing in their favorite books and spending 2 or 3 minutes talking about what they really like. I think what we're really looking at is for kids to know that in addition to parents, there are other safe adults that you can reach out to if you need help. So I think it's going to change based on the age of children. With younger kids, maybe things like this favorite book, lunch together, bring your pet to your class kind of thing works. With older kids, we may be looking at getting them to run quizzes based on themes, or looking at them, just having a day off from academic work where whoever would like to join in joins in, plays their musical instrument, just doing that for kids to also have some change, because life has become really monotonous. I think you can't pretty much by the minute clock your day. So something once in a week does sort of make things a bit more motivating for children.
Absolutely. And actually, incidentally, while you were speaking about this,
Hmm.
there has been another question by
Okay.
Mahalakshmi who asks how to make sessions interesting and informative.
Learning sessions in the sense,
Like learning sessions in
yeah,
school.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think keep them short. I think it's important that they are not lectures. When I say lecture, I don't mean like a boring lecture. What I'm saying, it isn't just the teacher talking. You're looking at having different kinds of media coming in. So you are also possibly looking at adjusting your difficulty level. It isn't something that needs to be accessible. So you're looking at stuff that's accessible to everybody. So that makes it a little bit more, the kids are a bit more engaged, because if it is something that's hard, you're not going to get very engaged kids. It's easier to remedy that in school. It's not as easy to do that here. So if you're looking at combinations of things like quizzes, looking at group presentations, it is also then getting kids to interact a little bit more with each other outside of school. You're looking at polls. Um, if possible, you teach in batches. That's also something that makes kids a bit more, interested in interacting with each other. But I think check in frequently with how kids would like this to be taught. I think that's really important to hear their voice in this, because when they're committed to it or they're involved in it, they're likely to be a lot more cooperative and engaged.
Yeah. I think it's a good time for kids to be able to tell everyone how it is that they
Yeah,
want to learn. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
We actually have a follow-up
Okay,
question from Varun Rangarajan, the person who previously spoke
sure.
about
Yeah.
said that there's one more issue that my son struggles a lot to open up online and talk to people. He's so nervous, and every time the teacher asks him something, he freezes even if he knows the answer. How can I, as a parent, help?
Yeah, okay, yeah. I think it's just overwhelming for kids to see these many boxes. And I think in class, the way seating works, all eyes are not on you, but here you're just perceiving that everybody is looking at you. So I think if your child is struggling, maybe if you can get your child to interact with his peers in smaller groups or just one-on-one, getting him comfortable with just two or three kids before the whole bunch of kids. Or maybe if you're getting your child, when he's asked a question, to just write down the answer first and then say it out, because it can feel like you're put on the spot. And I think what also happens is, for kids, they're also seeing themselves and they've never seen themselves. So that is also a bit um, discerning for them. They're just disconcerted by that. So I think that maybe if you're looking at building your child's confidence in other ways, so let's imagine your teacher were to ask you this question, what would your answer be? And getting your child to say that to you, and looking at sort of enhancing his academic thing outside, so that maybe the access in class is a little bit faster for him.
Correct. So speaking of online interactions, there is a very high chance that children spending so much more time online
Yeah.
have access to other things as well. So there is a chance that with social media being so used so much that they could be bullied online.
Yes.
So what can a parent do about it in terms of online bullying? How do they have this conversation? Or if the
Yeah.
child is being bullied, what can they do?
Right. Yeah. I think it's very hard to know, firstly, if a child is being bullied, because they're going to go to to great lengths to hide it, to cover it up, because one, they're scared that the technology is going to be taken away. And the second is that they know that their parents are going to, be concerned. So I think that if we're looking, like we do with other difficult topics, if we're looking at conversations about it, helping your child understand what online bullying looks like, how, I think sometimes kids dismiss online bullying a lot faster than they do physical bullying, because they feel like, no, he didn't really mean it, or it was a joke, or they're very quick to dismiss online bullying. So if you're maybe talking to them about how online bullying does impact children as much as it does other forms of bullying, helping them recognize signs of bullying, and sort of helping them understand why it is important to report. It is as important for the child who is being bullied to report as it is for the child who is bullying. We need the bullying behavior to stop. So we want to get kids to feel like, okay, there is something that you can do about it. So if you're then maybe looking at, maybe as a parent, it's hard for you to come up and talk to me about it. But who is another adult in school that you can reach out to? So that you're actually building in sort of a redressal mechanism when something comes up. But this is something that cannot be a one-time conversation. This really needs to be revisited, and for you as a parent to hold on to your own reactions to how your child is dealing with bullying online.
I'd like to remind all the viewers that we are nearing the end of the webinar. So if you have more questions, please do put them in the comment section. So we will take them at this point.
Yeah.
So finally coming to the end of this, Radhika, we did talk a lot about how there's pressure on parents, there's pressure on teachers, and they're going out of their way to really support the children.
Yeah.
So how do we, and we know that this, especially for adults, is a very energy sapping exercise, right? And everyone, we ourselves are feeling a lot of hopelessness, of despair, and it is difficult. So do you have any self-care tips for teachers and parents in this sort of a situation?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I think more than ever, I think it is important for the adults to be taking care of themselves. And I think for parents, especially, to see that taking care of yourself is not selfish. I feel like culturally there is this tendency for a lot of parents to think that, I need to be okay and I'm okay. But to understand that there are limitations, and these limitations are likely to be a lot more right now than they ever were. So I would say that taking aside time for yourself is actually you taking care of your child in a way. So look at it that way. Very, very, at the risk of sounding repetitive, ensure your sleep is sorted. You're making sure that you're getting enough sleep, because it's just so much easier to handle the number of stresses that are going to come the next day if you are rested. And I think that if you're looking at some physical activity as a parent or a teacher, it just helps get some of that stress out, because I think it's worth acknowledging at this point that the stresses are not necessarily going away. Right? We're not going to wake up one fine day and everything's going to go back to normal. It's going to be a gradual reopening process. So I think if you can look at building your toolkit of coping mechanisms, I think it will be good for you, and it'll also be good for your child and your students to see you do that. So maybe as a parent, I'm saying, okay, I'm going to go down for a walk for half an hour because this helps me be calm. Your child is likely to pick up on that and model a self, sort of soothing activity himself or herself. Routines are good. So to just look at some kind of flexible routine, because it just keeps some of that uncertainty out. There's more goal-oriented behavior when you know what's coming next. And something else that I think that adults should really be focusing on is staying connected to family and friends. Right? I think that it's been, like we talked about, how this pandemic has been so isolating, and it's very easy to just get overwhelmed by everything that's going on. So I think we all need a little bit of hope. We all need a little bit of something to look forward to say that, okay, I will tide through this. I'm going to take one day at a time, and let's see what tomorrow brings. So that does mean bringing into your own way of doing things some changes. So I would focus on sleep, eating, physical activity, routine, finding activities that relax you, and staying connected. I think these are my top few tips for all adults.
Taking one last question from our audience before we wrap up. Kanchan wants to know, do you think online assessments are necessary given the environment, which is uncertainty and anxiety levels are already so high?
Yeah. So I think that online assessments, if you're looking at like board examinations versus smaller tests, I think it's a little bit different. I think that regular assessments are helpful. It also keeps children motivated. They know that their learning is translating into something, because they're not going to necessarily be motivated if there isn't a test or there isn't an exam coming up. I agree that with board examinations, the conversation is a slightly more nuanced one. I think that but I still think that some form of assessment would be useful. Maybe we're looking at changing this form of assessment. But if we don't have a form of assessment, I feel like kids are just going to lose that little bit of drive to learn. I think that the form of assessment needn't be what it has always been. So we've already looked at, lower amount of studying to be done. Maybe we're looking at more flexibility with the kind of assessments as well. But I think that just keeps kids a bit focused on things. Otherwise, we're going to be very tempted to not, kids are going to be very tempted to not learn at all, because there is nothing that's an end goal that they're working towards.
Yeah. Also, speaking of a reopening, you did mention when you're talking about the self-care tips that it will be a gradual reopen. We are seeing in some parts of the country that schools have started opening up physically. Sometimes they've opened and shut again, and then they've opened again. So there's again a bit of uncertainty. So just thought we'd kind of touch upon how it would be different for the children and how the parents and teachers can prepare the kids in some way if and when schools begin.
Yeah, that's $1 million question that I don't think there's a very clear answer to. But I think reopening needs to be done with some amount of flexibility, with some amount of gradation. I don't think it can be that a whole bunch of kids come back, because we're also going to be seeing the effects of the pandemic and changes when we do come back. So I suspect kids are going to have trouble socially. The younger kids, just those old friendships may have sort of not won't be those friendships anymore. With older kids, I feel like their ways of dealing with conflict may have gotten a little bit impacted. I feel children are going to have difficulties with staying seated and learning. There's going to be, in my mind, we have to see what happens, a lot more distractibility. So I think we're going to have to be prepared for doing quite a bit with the social bit. So maybe going back and getting kids to relearn some social skills. So work in smaller groups, look at perhaps going over even academic foundation skills all over again. I think a lot of learning loss would have happened, and we need to really keep that going. But I think the most important thing that schools would possibly have to do is to in some way accept that these changes are, very, very appropriate. They are natural. So we're going to have to take it slow, not have unreasonable expectations out of children and ourselves. I think it's going to be hard even as teachers and adults for us to get back to life. So I think we need to just be a lot more compassionate with each other and ourselves when we get back. Yeah.
All right. I guess we come to the end of this. Thank you so much, Radhika. It was amazing to hear your thoughts on this. And I think the parents and teachers who have attended would have gone back with a lot of good information on how they can help students deal with this.
Thank you. I'm so glad we did this. And maybe if there are some questions that we weren't able to answer, if you can maybe, if there's anything, we can just sort of put them together, put some answers and put it up on the portal or something, if anything comes up like that.
Absolutely. Actually, we would see a link to everyone who's watching. There will be an email that we'll be putting out, connect@whiteswanfoundation.org. If you have any questions that you missed, or if you happen to watch this video later and have questions for Radhika, do write to us. We can always get her to help us with those answers and put it up on the portal. So we also do have a lot of resources for parents and students to access. These are mental health resources available on our portal. You would probably be seeing a link right now in the comments section. These are helplines that you could contact if you need to speak to someone, if you need to, find help with something that you're going through. So it's a good idea to encourage children. Also, there are helplines for children to help to see this as well. All right. Thank you, Radhika.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to White Swan for doing this. I think this was a very good idea.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for coming in on a Saturday evening. It was a great session. And do visit our portal, whiteswanfoundation.org. We have a lot of information for not just children, but also for adults and older populations on how you can help your own mental health and health. Thank you.